Last few days, you've seen conversation after conversation, like the one we've just seen with Corinda, around how local councils are failing, how so many of them are just not able to provide proper services. Look at all the issues around water in Joburg recently, the long-running problems in Verulam, the even longer-running problems in Nanda. Now the organisation Good Governance Africa has launched a new report examining how each council is doing, looking at how they've been able to provide services, or why and how they have failed. Pranish Desai is a data analyst at Good Governance Africa, joining us now. Pranish, good afternoon to you. Firstly, how do you actually assess these councils and metros? How do you do it?
Good afternoon, Stephen. It's great to be with you in studio as Human Rights and with your viewers at home as well. So the Governance Performance Index, which is the recent report that GGA has just put out, scores and ranks South Africa's 257 municipalities according to several main categories of performance. Local and district municipalities, of which there are 205 local municipalities and 44 districts, are scored according to four main categories, these being administration and governance. So that looks at things like, many of the inputs into the Auditor General reports. A lot of people know the headline findings of the AG, but we take a bit of a deeper dive into the various scores and various indicators. There's a category called planning, monitoring and evaluation, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. There's a category called leadership and management, which is a new category we've introduced for this report. That looks at a number of things, including the AG score on effective leadership culture in municipality, as well as the score municipalities are getting for risk management strategies, in addition to what the rate of vacancies are at the municipal management level. So looking at the strength of administrative capacity in a municipality. And lastly, and most importantly, given the constitutional role envisaged for local government in South Africa, we look at service delivery. And with the service delivery category, which is, as I said, weighted most, we look at a number of critical things, including the quality of services. So there we look at the recently relaunched Blue Drop, Green Drop reports, among other things. We look at the total access households have to services. So out of a proportion of however many households, how many have access to critical services like water or electricity or sanitation services. And finally, we look at the support that municipalities provide to indigent, so the most vulnerable households in their area.
Okay, so it's very detailed, it sounds very scientific. You come to the finding, you'll be accused of playing politics here, but you come to the finding that Cape Town provides the best level of services in metros. How did you come to that conclusion?
So I've just explained the indicators we look at when it comes to service delivery specifically. What we do see when it comes to service delivery across the country is that history plays a very important role, and I think more of a role than most politicians of any party would care to actually admit in terms of determining municipal functionality today. In the case of metros, what you often see is that the most affluent areas retain at least accessibility levels that are much higher, which on an index like the GPI can create better performances for them. We have seen general declines in the service quality in a lot of places, including some major cities, as we've seen experiencing in Joburg recently. But broadly, I think what was one of the highlights of the metro section of our report was that the two sort of metros which were the strongest performing across multiple categories were Ekurhuleni and Cape Town, and each of them took different paths to getting there. So, for example, the issue of coalitions has been a very prominent one in recent years. And what we saw between 2016 and 2021 was that Ekurhuleni had a formal coalition arrangement, whereas Johannesburg and Tshwane, its peer Gauteng metros, did not have. And if you just look at three critical aspects of municipal functionality, so audit outcomes, the overall one, Blue Drop scores, so the quality of your water systems, and Green Drop scores, the quality of your wastewater systems, Ekurhuleni did better at the end of that 5-year cycle, so around about 21, than it did at the beginning, whereas Joburg did better on some indicators and worse on others, and Tshwane did worse on all three. And so I think that as national policymakers start thinking about how we might manage coalitions at every level, that's a very useful example for them to look at.
When you say that, for example, Cape Town provides the best level of services in a metro, can you see or can you say that it's providing better services for everyone? So as a way of comparison, people in Khayelitsha, just for way of an example, are getting better services than someone in Tembisa or Diepsloot.
So what we are able to see with the GPI is that, what is the extent of support that is being provided for indigent and most vulnerable households. And there we're looking at the overall proportion of support. So if a municipality has identified 500,000 households, that are indigent within the area, then if they're servicing about 80% of those with free basic services, they'll obviously score better on that indicator than a municipality that's only servicing 45%. So that's the sort of variation we take into account when looking at, how much support is being given to the most vulnerable households. With any index, you'll obviously run into the problem that one of the core things that you have to focus on is being fair, and so you have to score most places according to what they're actually responsible for, A, but B, also what data is actually available to you. So in terms of, comparing whether the residents of Khayelitsha are getting better or worse services than those in Tembisa, that would be something that we'd have to grade according to, the national framework. Can we actually get reliable data for a bunch of areas and thus compare like for like?
It can be incredibly complicated. We've been focusing on the metros. The smaller councils, I imagine you see the same things. I mean, from what I can see from your index, some places in the Western Cape seem to score the best. Again, history would be important to that, but then so would current management.
Yes. So I think among the most important factors are history, current management, previous historical performance. These do not need be inescapable things. So one of the examples the report highlights is the example of a municipality called Winnie Madikizela Mandela municipality in the Eastern Cape. And in one of the first GPIs, it was actually the lowest ranking municipality. In the most recent edition, it scored second amongst its category of municipal performance, which is mostly rural municipalities. And one of the main reasons that it did do better was financial management in that place improved quite dramatically over the last few years. And that place still does have a lot of service delivery challenges. For example, their main service delivery function as a municipality is waste removal, and only 16% of households, according to Census 2022, actually had regular services. But that's actually an increase from 2% in 2016 from the community survey.
There was a council in 2016 where only 2% of people had their waste removed.
So, yes. So, what you are seeing is that if you reduce things like wasteful expenditure, irregular expenditure, then you can start diverting it more towards areas where you need to build more infrastructure to service more households. And thus, improvements will take time. But the point is that you can see improvements with good leadership.
Around the world, it's very difficult to say living here is better or worse than living there. There's some obvious things, but there's so many different factors to it. Often it's about communities that you grew up in that you don't want to leave, for example. One of the things that I think has happened in our politics is that we use Auditor General findings as a proxy. And this is one of the reasons you see councils celebrating so much and so intensely if they get a clean audit, because they say, look, this proves that life here in Midvaal, or life here in Cape Town, or life here in, there's some small municipalities in the Eastern Cape run by the ANC, which consistently get clean audits. And they say that this shows that life here is better. From what you've looked at, well, you've taken some Auditor General data, you've taken other data, the Blue Drop and Green Drop reports. Can we say that how a council, a metro, or a municipality fares with the Auditor General is a useful proxy to the quality of life and services?
So I think there's an interesting contrast between the Western Cape and Gauteng, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, that has built up. So especially since the coalition era started in Gauteng. And there what we're seeing is that both the Western Cape and Gauteng actually score fairly similar on quality of services. It's a 0.00 difference on the overall GPI when you're looking at the average scores by municipality. But when you look at the category of administration, so one where the Auditor General reports play more of a role, there we are seeing that the gap starts to widen because a lot of the issues with coalitions have been negatively impacting financial management of municipalities. And down the line, you might expect that to erode the quality of services. So Tshwane, as an example, was in a much better place with its Green Drop report score in 2014 than it was in 2022. And, what has happened then is greater instability in that council, for which we can have a number of explanations for why that might be the case. But it does highlight the fact that, to at least some extent, audit opinions can inform you about the state of overall service delivery, but it's only one of the determining factors. It can't override something like history. If a place had 10% of access in 1994, it's going to be much harder to build more infrastructure there and get it to 80% than a place that was on 70% in 1994.
A useful analogy is that the Eastern Cape Education Department's had crisis after crisis because it had 2 homelands in that area. We see issues around service delivery there. We see it in Northwest, also areas with homelands at the time. You talk about transparency in your report. Why is that so important when it comes to service delivery and how councils manage themselves?
So the main context in which we speak about transparent governance institutions in the report is highlighting to South Africans in particular how important these are for their daily functioning as a society. So one of the things GJ is looking to do is expand this tool elsewhere in Southern Africa, because that is our mandate as an organization. But what you see is that, institutions like the Auditor General or even Stats SA are much rarer than we'd like to, think across this region. And so transparent governance institutions relate to the fact that municipalities are compelled by law, by the MFMA, Municipal Finance Management Act, to submit regular financial statements to Treasury, and then you have an independent institution like the Auditor General verify that. That's really important because it can give citizens some inkling into how, some of the taxpayer money that comes through the grants from national level to municipalities is spent, how some of their rates and taxes from a, revenue collection standpoint is being spent and allocated. And so it's really important for South Africans to not take that for granted. Democratic dissatisfaction is rising in South Africa. Probably one of the reasons is low levels of municipal functionality. But it is important for South Africans to really realize, especially on a day like Human Rights Day, that these democratic institutions offer the best hope for getting out of this muddle. And, those solutions won't be found if you move towards other alternatives.
Pranish Desai, thank you very much indeed. Data analyst at Good Governance Africa. In a moment,